A Sustainable Mind, Episode 9. This is A Sustainable Mind podcast, where we delve into the minds behind today's most impactful environmental campaigns, organizations, and startups, inspiring the environmental changemakers of tomorrow. I'm your host, Marjorie Alexander. Today, I am incredibly excited to have on the show someone that I think is doing truly amazing things for our planet, Topher White. Topher is the founder and CEO of Rainforest Connection. You might have seen his moving and informative TED Talk, where he discusses the challenges of protecting the world's forests from illegal logging and the device that he created to solve that issue. Topher also has a background in web-based communication and kinetic sculpture. So, Topher, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Marjorie. It's really cool to be here. I love what you guys are doing, too.
Thanks. I've told the audience a tiny bit about you, not too much. So why don't you go ahead and fill in the gaps a little bit for us? Give us some more detail as to your background.
Oh, well, so when it comes to me, actually, I guess I can just sort of say that I like to build things. I've always been sort of that type of person. And so this project is particularly great, and I'll sort of get into that in a moment. It's particularly great because I get to build stuff that people can use in all sorts of different sorts of ways around in the forest, or in the forest to here in the United States and elsewhere. But really, I guess my background is in physics when it comes to study. And then, of course, as you sort of pointed out, since then, that's led me to a lot of different micro careers before this one, including, as you said, kinetic sculpture, communication, things like that. But no, I think at the very base, I just sort of find myself as an engineer and always sort of led back to that, no matter what sort of area I get into.
So I think what a lot of people want to know is they want to peek a little bit behind the curtain and understand the mind behind the projects. Can you tell us a little bit about your childhood and how environmental sustainability or earth-conscious living played a role in your lifestyle growing up? And if so, how?
I think it's a great question because I think a lot of people who get involved, Rainforest Connection is sort of, on the surface, it's an environmental organization. It's a nonprofit where we're trying to save the rainforest and help people do that who are out there in the forest. But really, in terms of the identity of the company, it's a tech company. And really what we're trying to answer is the fact that everyone who sort of lives in the United States or lives all over the place right now, they sort of have this narrative growing up that we have to save the rainforest. We're hearing about it all the time. And there has to be some way that we're using the stuff that we're already used to, we're already doing in our daily lives that can actually help with that. So in my case, when I was growing up, environmental sustainability was not a very big part of the conversation, at least in my family. But we were always out sort of in nature. We went hiking a lot. We would go out and catch animals with my brother. And my dad was a physicist, and my mother taught kids with dyslexia how to read. And so there was this sort of constant curiosity that was fostered in us. And a lot of this came into sort of taking on pets. So we had a lot of pets that we would catch from nature in California and bring back to our house. But we lived in a city. We lived in San Francisco. So, it's not like the forest was a daily part of our lives. And in fact, the whole idea of the rainforest is very abstract. But I had some great teachers who really talked to us a lot about the importance of this. So I sort of thought there was something we could do when it came to tech to apply for this.
Like most people, there comes a turning point in our lives where we learn something that causes a light bulb to go off. For you, it was probably your first visit to the rainforest, but I want to talk for a second about who you were before that in terms of your consumerism and your interaction with nature. You just talked about your interaction with nature as a child, but when you were becoming an adult and beginning to make your own consumer choices, was the environment something that you were conscious of in that time?
I think that, as people in sort of a modern society, particularly around San Francisco, which is on the surface a very conscious area about this, we hear about it a lot. And so certainly it's one of these things that you're aware of your footprint. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it was the primary factor in the decisions that I would make, particularly because it's not really a primary factor that most people get to throw in the decisions they make. A lot of them are financially based. So I've always sort of wanted to be able to apply to it, but actually shaping your life around it is hard and takes a great deal of attention. So prior to this, I was an engineer. I was working on a lot of web apps, a lot of sort of startup based projects, and in physics, some labs. And at a certain point, I left to go to ITER, which is a large physics lab in France, trying to build a fusion power plant. And I was really inspired by that project because it is basically a clean source of power no long-lasting nuclear waste, no sort of carbon footprint, and potentially geopolitically insensitive fuel. So I thought that was a really exciting project. It's sort of the holy grail of energy research. But of course, it is still an experiment, and we're trying to build it. But that's the reason that I left the United States to go to France to do that. And it was really while I was there that I sort of saw, not to judge any of these fantastic scientific advances that we have to point in there, but a lot of the research and technology that's going into climate change and how to affect it, it really is, there's limits to it because it can only be adopted at a certain rate and only can be built at a certain rate. And so it sort of occurred to me while I was there that there would have to be some sort of conservation of existing resources, conservation and the avoidance of dumping carbon to the atmosphere that was not solely technology oriented. It would have to be based on the conservation of, say, our forests. So at the time, I was actually I went to Indonesia as a tourist to volunteer at a gibbon reserve, really just for a couple of weeks, because I've always sort of loved gibbons. They were the loudest animals at the zoo. While I was there, what we actually noticed was that the group that we were there to volunteer with, a lot of what they spent their time on was essentially trying to protect their land from illegal logging. And so because of my background in technology and sort of building apps for startups, I really figured I could build some sort of hack together some little system that could help them figure out where the logging was taking place and show up in real time. But I didn't realize at the time that any sort of impact we could have on illegal logging was really one of the larger answers to fighting climate change, at least in terms of our personal footprint. Because at the time I didn't realize that up to 17% of all the carbon emissions that happen every year come from deforestation, which is more than all of the cars, trucks, ships, planes, all the vehicles combined, all the transportation combined. And at the same time, so much of the deforestation, up to 90% that happens in the forest, is illegal, that if you can actually stop some illegal logging, you can really bite into that 17%. But all this I wasn't really aware of it at the time, but I figured it out within a few months of just working on this project, really to help out these friends that I met in Indonesia. And that's when I realized that this was something that I could do to fight climate change, even if it seems very small, some way that I could really have an impact, today. And so that's why I sort of got into it. And that's what we found is why people actually enjoy working on this project for the same sorts of reasons.
Based on the number of units that you've deployed thus far that are up and running in real time right now, do you have any sort of indication as to the number of acres or hectares of rainforest that you saved because of this device so far?
So we're still very early. It's still very much in the proving phase of this. We're still doing feasibility studies. So even if we've been deployed for several months in these regions, we would always stop short of saying that we've saved those areas. Not only because it's so early, but also because it's not really us that are doing it. It's our sort of local partners. So really, we're just trying to build tools that help them do what they're trying to do, which is protect the forest where they're from. But in all these cases, what we're actually discovering is that the most useful tools aren't necessarily real-time alerts. The most useful tools are forensic data that allow them to then take on to fight these things like sociologically. So a lot, in certain places in Indonesia, it was all about these real-time alerts that help people to show up and stop it. That was a say 200 hectare reserve, a 200 hectare reserve in Indonesia. And that's a situation where we can say that based on this event from our system, they were able to stop the loggers and they haven't been back since. But since then, what we've been trying to do is focus on much larger areas and trying to go for like surgically insert our system in places that are most effective. To therefore know how many acres that were actually, well, an example of the surgically effective thing would be in Africa, for example, there's 4,000 square kilometers of forest. And the only access point into those 4,000 square kilometers of forest is a single road in and out. And that road happens to be the road upon which all of the illegal wood is removed, all of the poaching goes in and out on this road, all of the vehicles for that. And so working with our partners there, we set up our system along that road and picked up a hefty volume of illegal vehicle traffic related to illegal logging and poaching. That they're then able to use to potentially stamp it out. But then to say that we are protecting, that full 4,000 square kilometers, or even that they are, we would always try and stop short of making such claims. But really, it's all about building the tools that they want there on the ground. And as long as they feel that their forest isn't being further degraded or further destroyed, that's the point at which we can declare success. But I would say that anywhere we go, anywhere we really would go to try and make a difference, that usually can take months or years. And we've only been at this for a year so far.
Wow. So in the building of Rainforest Connection and in the launching of the Kickstarter and the relationships that you've built here in the States, What are the people that you have found yourself connecting with that became an integral part of the success of this organization and your projects and campaigns overall?
Wow. I mean, we've had a really major outpouring of support from all sorts of different people. A day doesn't go by where we don't receive a nice email from someone offering to help us on the technical side of things, offering to help us on the translation of our content, asking us if they can use our system in the field, which is unfortunately one of those things that then comes down to, funding. So, I mean, we get people from all over it sort of runs the gamut. Environmental organizations have been very supportive because they're always into supporting, new technologies that are going to it. The fact that we're open source really helps because we don't really want to build something that's a walled garden. We want to make sure that other people can use either our entire system or parts of it. So the open source community has been very helpful. And just, I hate to say random, but literally random people will find us online simply by Googling around for terms, and they'll come to us and say, hey, I'd love to volunteer some time to help out. In many ways, we assumed that being in San Francisco would be one of the most advantageous things when it came to finding people to work on the project. Mm-hmm. What we found is being in San Francisco towards Silicon Valley is very helpful for keeping track of the sort of status quo of tech industry, which really moves very quickly. But when it comes to help, people have come from all over the place. And our tech team, particularly is distributed probably across all the continents at this point. And that's been really inspiring to see. So, yeah, people come from all over and that's one of the reasons that it's great to talk to people like you, because you're helping spread the word about what the project is about. And that tends to bring people to us to help sort of join the team.
Excellent. And I just want to give your website a quick plug. So anybody who is interested in donating or getting involved in other ways can visit Topher's website at rfcx.org. You can donate and get involved. What are some of the ways that people can get involved that are not monetary donations? Yeah,
so I mean, it's a bunch of donations do tend to be really help us the most because we're pretty bootstrapped. But yeah, people tend to donate phones. That's very helpful. They donate phones if, in a lot of cases, we're able to put them up in the forest and turn them into these devices that listen for the sounds of chainsaws, or guns or vehicles and actually send these alerts. So those phones can be converted for that. If we can't, we will often then give them to rangers, who can use sort of like a phone upgrade for them, which really motivates them as well. And in the end game, if we're not able to use them there, then we will, help turn that into funding for the projects. So donating phones is great. We're always looking for help, when it comes to translating, various content, to producing content, to spreading the word, to really helping get the word out because, it feels like we receive a lot more credit than we deserve for sure. Because we're really just getting started. But the great thing about that is that you could be the one to come to us to suggest a project that really is the perfect application of our technology or the technology of ours plus others. So, if you have ideas for how this can be used, please do come to us because we're always interested in that as well.
So you said that your devices also pick up on the sound of trucks and gunshots. Is this something that you've considered deploying for protecting other reserves? I was thinking, you can listen for the sound of gunshots, but if you're talking about poaching, the sound of a gunshot would probably be too late. So what are some of your ideas of how this device could be deployed and utilized in other ways?
So that's a great question. In our case, we really don't actually put a limit on how it can be used. We can certainly put a limit on what we're able to detect, right? Mm-hmm. And that currently, I should really clarify, gunshots are not something that we currently support. It's something we're working on supporting in the near future. But we don't currently, send alerts for gunshots. And similar to what you said, in the case of a gunshot, it's usually too late at that point anyway. But what we found is that particularly in Africa, where the primary focus of our work there is less about, the logging and more about the poaching, mm-hmm. which has really been accelerating at a very, high rate. Most people who come in, they come in on vehicles. And so if you can pick up the vehicles, for the poachers on the way in, then it's not too late. And so really this focus on roads, which tend to be the biggest sort of drivers of deforestation and poaching anyway, that's where we're currently trying to focus on. But how that can be used, it's not just about wildlife poaching. If somebody, in our partners in Brazil, for example, the indigenous tribe, the Tembe, who have about 7,000 square kilometers of forest, and there's only about 1,500 of them left. And they're really sort of fighting for their survival. It's really deforestation on all sides. Then there's basically illegal loggers, there's poaching, there's illegal drug plantations, and just generally illegal settlers that are pushing in from all sides. And they only control about 20% of it right now. The Tembe do, which means they have to retake 80%. So in that case, Really what it's about is helping them set up a system around the official edges of their reserve, which they have to take responsibility for protecting, because the government doesn't have the resources or interest in helping them do it. And what are they actually stopping? Well, it's not just incursions related to illegal logging. It's incursions related to drug trafficking, incursions related to just illegal settling, and of course poaching as well. So how it's going to be used, we wouldn't really put a limit on that. But if we're able to sell someone, the moment you can know the moment someone drives a car in to your land, and we can do it in a cheap open source way that relies upon infrastructure, that's the point at which they start to imagine what the applications are.
So we've been talking a lot about the logistics of getting this stuff done, the engineering behind it. I want to touch a little bit on the emotional impact that some of these trips out into the field have had on you. Do you have a story or two that you could share with us of a really moving moment for you personally?
Yeah. Let's see. I think that I'll just go back on the Tembe moment. When we go down and work with the Tembe are people that, as far as they're concerned, they're fighting for their survival. In our case, what we're seeing is people on sort of both sides who, just to clarify, the Tembe are a tribe who are surrounded by sort of illegal loggers and incursion, but these are people who are settlers. There's a real culture of taking back the land. But as far as the Tembe are concerned, it's actually an ethnic conflict and ethnic war. And so to talk to them and to have them say something to us like, we really feel like just being able to know when someone comes into our land is the key to actually the survival of our tribe, the survival of our people, the survival of our culture. For me, that's a completely overblown statement, but it does sort of underscore the fact that the things that we take for granted, which is like knowing when someone fires up a chainsaw right down the street, or knowing when someone drives past our house. These are things that we take for granted because we live in such a technologically fit world. But out there in the forest, the same standards don't necessarily apply. And if you can just add something that we take for granted here in the West, and give it to them, in many cases, they feel like it's the key, it's like that extra step that allows them to really hold off an existential threat.
Absolutely. And I think so often people in Western society forget that some of the things that we take for granted on an everyday basis can really mean the difference between, at some points, life and death for people in other cultures around the world. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure. And I mean, just to follow up on that, I think that it's when it comes to people actually coming up with, like, applying their ideas to problems that matter, especially in the tech industry, there's just really a focus on like what's new and what's high tech and like what's the newest thing out there, especially when it comes to, developers, and people who are actually building these things. But I really can't underscore enough that what's new is absolutely not at all the most important thing to know or the most important thing to use. It's really what's already there. Like what's a technology that to us seems old and might even not be in use anymore, but for people out in the forest is incredibly useful and brand new. And if you can help bring that expertise to problems that they have, basically solve somebody else's problem that we don't have anymore, then you can really empower them to solve a problem that we can't actually solve. So we can't save the rainforest, only they can. But saving the rainforest is far more important than perhaps even driving an electric car. And if you can help them do that, by doing something that you take for granted, then you'll feel incredibly empowered and incredibly rewarded.
Wonderful. Do you have any specific piece of advice to give people that are in the tech industry or are in engineering or in science who want to apply their knowledge and their gifts to saving the world in any large or small way, but don't really know how to get started? I mean, taking engineering and applying it to something, and it really is actually a simple idea, but it's brilliant, and I guess no one had really considered it before this time. But for people who want to take that extra step and apply what they know to these problems, what is an overarching suggestion that you could give those people?
Well, I think that it sort of comes down to, if you're starting a business, you should solve a problem that somebody actually has. So you shouldn't solve a problem in a space, unless you know how to solve it in ways that other people don't. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't solve a problem that's really 90% solved. We live in a great period of time where you can actually go online and figure out what the problems that are bothering people in other parts of the world happen to be. Mm-hmm. And so if you're capable, if you're able to go online, this is something for you. and you're able to go to places, particularly in places where you don't speak the same language as you on the web, and see what you can find. Like, what are the things that people are complaining about, and look for the sort of subtleties that come down to driving those problems that they're complaining about. And I hate to always use the same example with indigenous people, but it's just such a good example. For them, the issue is we don't control 80% of our land. And why is that? Well, it's not because 80% of that land is actually controlled by other people. It's because they don't know where to go, when, and at what time in order to be safe. And so just knowing where someone is, like when people are on your land, is extremely helpful there. So for them, so that was very poorly articulated, but I really just can't stress enough that solving other people's problems is the key of any business, the key of any sort of launching any project. If you're not doing that, then it's hard to scale at all. And the further away you look, sometimes the easier the problem seems to solve. And as long as they agree with you that what you're doing is a solution, then you will have succeeded.
Absolutely. Jumping now to, I don't want to use the word inspiring, that might be a little bit too big, but really just getting people on track, just everyday people who want to be more environmentally conscious. Are there any books that you could suggest for sustainable minds out there that really want to work on their mindset specifically?
Great question. So the favorite book that I read recently, and this was a big surprise to me, it's called Big Trees, I believe. It's basically about tree climbing. And I was expecting it to read just sort of like a nonfiction sort of thing. But no, what it actually did is it pointed out the importance of these sort of slow ecosystems that exist for tens of thousands or millions of years, and with a particular focus on the redwoods in California and Oregon, and how this used to be a huge, enormous forest that stretched all the way up the coast. And there are organisms in these forests that don't even show up, that live on the trees, but don't even show up until the trees have existed for 500 to 1,000 years. And just like the amount of sort of fragility of a system that the amount of time it takes for that to happen, and the protection of that system really forces you to think about time and sustainability very differently. Another great book that I cannot recommend enough is called The Clock of the Long Now. I definitely recommend this to engineers with the same sort of idea. And there's actually an organization built around it, but the whole idea is, what if we wanted to build a clock, a machine that basically it would ding every century, sorry. They would click every millennium, and then it would ding every 10,000 years, something like that. And the engineering challenge is the way it forces you to think about the way in which we build things, and really just about civilization in general, was really very inspiring to me. And I read that a long time ago. But it's always nice to think about building things that work slowly and things that last, versus sort of having to build things anew every day. And if you can find a balance between those two, then you will have discovered the secret to engineering, which I have not discovered yet.
You're okay. I'm sure you're going to get there.
Sure. Thanks.
If you can share with us one long-standing habit that you believe has drastically improved your life, what would you say that is?
I think that taking conversation from like a scientific sort of outset, which is that you assume you're wrong in any conversation until you can sort of prove that you're right. That's sort of the only thing I think on top of my head, but hopefully I'll come up with some more.
No, that's fantastic advice, and honestly, I probably could do a little bit more of that.
I definitely could do a lot more of it, but I like to try.
So what is one new habit that you're cultivating in your life right now?
I am cultivating the habit of delegation. It's not something that I'm very good at. I don't have natural managerial instincts or natural managerial talent. But it's really important because this project, for example, can only move forward when other people, usually much more talented than I am, are taking on tasks. And so it's been a lot of fun and really sort of an uphill climb for me from the start to not only learn how to communicate, the delegation of tasks, but then to actually follow through with it and sustain it. Nobody is successful on their own in a project, and the more other people are working on it, then usually the better it ends up being. So delegation is one of these things that I'm just learning how to do. And I think for many engineers, it might be hard as well, particularly ones that sort of taught themselves particular skills.
And that is something that is, I think, important for a lot of businesses moving forward, getting to a point where you're really scalable for some people, it's important to be able to remove themselves from the equation at some point, because that's the only way that you can really move on to a different project or a different idea that you have. But so many people have this hero complex. They want to do all of it all the time because no one can do it better than me. I know that I have that problem, so.
I certainly do as well. But at the same time, I think there's a flip side to it as well. So when you're growing a business, that's something you shouldn't prematurely optimize for delegation. If you can bring people on board, that's great. But, you're often going to have trouble getting people on board to do it. Or people will say yes, but then they won't actually have time to do what they wish they could do for you. So being flexible enough to have to learn stuff, even when you're sick of learning new things, you just realize that you have to, it seems like a weird thing to say, but sometimes you're like, oh, I only have like a month before I have to do this. I don't have time to like learn this new like language enough to do this or to learn how to use a new machine or something like that. But I can think of half a dozen situations in the last like year and a half where we just had to learn something new in a short period of time. And of course, we didn't become experts, but just taking responsibility for doing stuff and being willing to make all the mistakes in case you can't find help. I think that's what successful entrepreneurs end up doing, is building the business themselves until they've inspired enough people to help them build it.
At what point in time did you actually start developing this device?
Yeah, I started building this in the beginning of 2013 and tested it in the sort of middle 2013 in Indonesia. And since then, it's been all about sort of improving the technology and building the organization, which has been the really slow part. And of course, raising funding, which is really still something we haven't cracked adequately.
Well, you did pretty well on your Kickstarter. I mean, you raised over 160,000 and your goal was only 100,000. So, apparently you got something right.
No, yeah, well, and I think that's, yeah, thank you. And I think there's something to be said for when it comes to sort of charity oriented, activities. And this is hard. What we're trying really to do is to take this organization and run it as like a legitimate business. So yes, we are a nonprofit. Yes, what we're doing is trying to save the rainforest, but we don't want to be the people that have to ask others for money how to do it. We want to provide some sort of service that brings them closer to the issues in a way that's actually enjoyable, and that would be something that they're willing to pay for. And that's really what we're trying to do. And that was what we're doing with the Kickstarter. I mean, don't just ask people to support an activity for the sake of it. Really stick to the Kickstarter, guidelines, which is, you're sharing something with somebody. And that can be a journey. It doesn't have to be a product, but that's really, I think, how we do well on Kickstarter and how we're trying to really grow the business as well.
So reflecting back on that time when you were developing this to get it ready to go onto Kickstarter, I don't like to say, would you have done anything differently? Because, everything that's happened kind of makes us who we are and makes the products that we do what they are. And I think a lot of us are very grateful for that. But if you could go back knowing everything that you know now and give yourself a key piece of advice to help things along, what would that be?
I think that the key piece of advice is content really rules any sort of communication. So probably the most important job for any organization like ours, we're really trying to like build enthusiasm around what we're doing, is just people who can pump out content, whether it be stories, whether it be images, whether it be infographics, whether it be, someone who really loves what you're doing and is able to just continually produce this. And you're doing this for us right now. Like, you're helping us get the word out. So thank you very much for that. But really finding people that love to communicate with others that find what you're doing interesting, because you'll always have an audience who finds what you're doing interesting. And if you have someone who can always sort of satisfy their hunger for it, then you're going to find out what it is that you can change that makes them more into it as well. So it's true for customers, it's true for fans, it's true for donors and supporters. So one thing that I'm still always looking for are people that can help us to really create the content that gets others excited about what we're doing, and really to communicate what we're doing, because it's a strength that I don't necessarily have. I'm not very good at just communicating with people, and it's the key to any Kickstarter campaign, any other campaign as well.
So speaking about content, do you have a specific internet resource? It can be a project, a tool, a specific campaign or organization that you would suggest to our listeners out there?
I would. So let's see. First of all, when it comes to delegation and management, I'm really excited about Slack these days. Slack is doing very well. And of course, I'm really into finding other startups. Like in our case, there's There's a great one called Sourcely. I mean, if you can find other startups that they're doing the jobs that you're not doing well, then usually they'll time with you. So Sourcely, for example, deals with donated phones. We're helping them, or they're helping us. Sourcely.com. But I'd say that Upwork, it used to be called Odesk, but Upwork.com, is basically a place where you can go on there and find people to help you with jobs and really bring them onto the team. But it's basically a marketplace for people that can offer up a few hours of work a week, or sometimes they can offer a full-time week. And the people that we found on there have really become core team members who are helping us push it forward. But finding and hiring people is really hard. So I would suggest Upwork.com. It's pretty cool.
Awesome. And all of that will be linked up in the show notes. So if you guys want to go and visit those, I'll have the links in the episode post. So before we get to the end here, I wanted to take a second and talk about your social media, which is pretty awesome. So you guys are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram under Rainforest CX. So RAINFOREST CX. And also, anybody who's interested can take a look at what people are doing out in the forest on your YouTube channel, which is RFCX.org.
Mm-hmm. And if you go to our website, rfcx.org, they're all sort of linked off the bottom as well. So you can do that too.
So do you have any words or parting pieces of guidance to give sustainable minds out there? Just an overarching idea or something that you've learned that you want to pass on, or anything that I didn't think to ask you?
Yeah. In our current state of society, this isn't even a complaint. In our current state of society, I think there's an overinflated importance given to ideas. Ideas are really important, but everybody who's really thinking, everybody who's paying attention should have ideas. And it's really the people that can deal with all of the disappointment and trouble of executing them, in whatever to whatever degree they can, that make a difference. Having an idea and talking about it simply isn't enough. You got to get out there and do it. And so any entrepreneurs that are doing that, they're sort of living that. And in fact, not to scare anyone out there, but there is actually a known psychological correlation between talking about an idea and not actually following through on it. So the more you talk about an idea, particularly when it comes to sustainability and the types of things that people say, oh, that would be great for the planet, something like that, there's actually a correlation between talking about something and it giving you those sort of good feelings that make you feel like you don't actually have to go ahead and do it. So don't talk too much about your idea before you get into it, because that in many ways will sort of keep you back from actually realizing it.
Thank you so much, Topher, for sharing your knowledge and your stories with us today on A Sustainable Mind. I want to have everyone go to the Rainforest Connection website, which is rfcx.org, to learn more, to donate your devices and find out other ways that you can get involved. So thank you so much, Topher. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you're traveling all around the world getting these things together to take some time and talk to us.
Cool. Thank you so much, Marjorie. It was a lot of fun to meet you and good to meet everyone else too.
You've been listening to A Sustainable Mind podcast. To hear more interviews just like this one, please subscribe on iTunes or visit asustainablemind.com. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.